Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, Elaine.
Morning.
Hi.
Morning.
So let's get started. I think I can. Yes. So good morning. Joining the European AI Policy Conference today. After our introductory speeches, we're now going through a series of conversations, starting with this one, which I have the pleasure of moderating. We'll be reflecting on how Europe can spread the benefits of AI. I will first introduce our guests before we dive into the conversation, and there will be some time for Q&As from our attendees, so please post your questions for the panelists in the stage chat on the right side of your Hopin screen. Please refrain from submitting question comments during active panel. If you have any comments about the conference as a whole, please put them in the event chat and the conference steps will assist you. You can also please fill in the polls that are also on the right side of your screen on Hopin. And finally, please feel free to tweet, of course, and engage on social media by using our handle and hashtag data innovation. Now, after this promotional introductory chat, let's get us all started, maybe with a bit of food for thought. So all European countries are developing their national AI strategies, but the capabilities vary widely across member states. And to remain competitive in the global race for AI, the EU will need more investment, more workers with AI relevant skills, more shared resources, including data, and a regulatory environment that will foster the development and use of AI. What progress have EU member states made in the past year to enhance European AI? How should policymakers ensure that no European countries and populations are left behind in AI? What are the policies that are necessary to ensure that AI contributes to prosperity for all Europeans? With me today to discuss, we're lucky to be with Michel van Leuwen, Director for Artificial Intelligence Policy at the Ministry of Security and Justice of the Government of the Netherlands. We have Dr. Sepp Hochheiter, Professor at the Johannes Kepler University Linz and Founding Director of the Institute of Advanced Research in AI in Vienna, which is the world's first global machine learning research institute to use industrial scale geolocation data, and it's been established by Here Technologies as well. We have Philip Malloch, Director Economic and Social Policy at Facebook. And last but not least, we have Dr. Magdalena Piersch, your Head of Regulatory Affairs at Allegro and Chair of the European Tech Alliance. Thank you so much to you all for being here today. Now, I wanted to maybe get started with you, Michel. So the EU really wants to position itself as a regulatory superpower, but its best chance to stand out in the global AI race could lie in showing how AI can truly benefit its society and ensuring prosperity and stability. What are, do you think, the best ways in which, in general, as a general introduction, perhaps, in which, you know, policymakers and decision makers could ensure the benefits of AI and data-driven innovation are truly inclusive?
Yes, well, I think we as European Union have a sort of a unique opportunity also in time, but also in terms of our background to get AI done right. I think that's what we are sort of about. We see examples in Asia in which probably there's a different definition and a different implementation of the subjects of human rights. We see in the United States maybe what I maybe would call a sort of overrepresentation of commercial values, and I think the European Union is sort of stands in between that and is able to sort of balance out those values and making sure that we get a prosperous society, a prosperous digital society, a prosperous AI society done right with responsible AI. Obviously, everyone is talking about the standard that has been set by the GDPR, and there's a big sort of gamble on that we can do that again on artificial intelligence. I think I'm not really sort of convinced that it will be about a very large and big set of regulations. We in the Netherlands feel that it's important to have a sort of a stepping stone approach, a learning approach, that we are sort of very aware on what kind of AI is coming inside our societies, and especially looking at high-risk AI, and then looking at in what ways we can use existing regulations and sort of interpret and implement existing regulations, and maybe build upon that to make sure that the high-risk AI that's going into our societies is being dealt with appropriately, and is being coming to good for every citizen in the European Union. So not looking at sort of massive regulation, but looking at where do we view that AI applications are getting out of hand, are potentially getting out of hand, and then looking what can we do with existing regulations, and then learning by doing, taking the small steps.
Thank you. I know the Netherlands have advocated for a learning approach in this respect. Maybe we'll get back to that later. I just wanted to follow up with just another question, because you mentioned implementation, and there's been some calls for a coordinated approach. But you can see still European member states, some of them still don't have national digitalization strategies, or they still haven't established so-called digital innovation hubs. And even the European Court of Auditors mentioned concerns over some of those hubs having limited support, receiving limited support from member states. Could you perhaps tell us about how we could overcome this problem?
Yeah, well, I think that's sort of a common problem we see in lots of areas in terms of European regulation. It's always the difficulty to have a good implementation. But I think getting together with Commission, maybe get some directives, getting some discussions on what do we feel that it's necessary to set up things. And one thing that comes to mind, I have a background in cybersecurity policy for the last 7-8 years, and the NIS directive, I think, was a good example on European countries coming together, deciding on a directive in which sort of a skeleton structure, which was agreed on to have to be set up in every country, and that consisted of having a strategy, having a national cybersecurity center, having some other basic things in place. So maybe some type of governance type regulation could be helpful.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Sepp Hochheister, because we've just discussed the digital innovation hubs, and they're a promising way, especially to reduce to address the so-called valley of death. That's basically what happens between a lab and an innovation happening in a lab, and whether or not it finds success on the market as a commercial application. And those hubs could be a way to reduce that gap. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you work? You're at the intersection of private sector, research, academia. How is it getting involved in this networks of hubs?
Perhaps I invented LSTM, which is now in every cell phone, in Android, in Siri. And it scares me that the stuff I'm inventing is used by Facebook. Google is approaching me every day on my doorstep. We invented 2017 something which is called self-normalizing networks, and Amazon contacted us and said they now made 1 billion turnover increase with this technique. And Apple gave me an email. They implemented it in Siri after half a year of our publications, and the guys from Amazon even bought me a mojito. And what scares me is Europe got a mojito. Actually, it was 2 mojitos to be correct. And Silicon Valley got $1 billion. And I don't think that was well done. Perhaps we can do better in Europe. we develop stuff. We developed the first wave of techniques which are in the cell phones, which Google and Amazon are using. We now develop the second wave, and China is using it, Silicon Valley is using it, but what's going on in Europe? Nothing. And this scares me. We're falling so far behind. This is serious. And there's a digital innovation hub. That's one initiative. We started another initiative. It's called ALICE. That stands for European Laboratory for Learning and Intelligent Systems, and is without European Union. It's really done by academic guys, the best ones in Europe, going together and connecting to industry. And this is where we directly want to get in the new techniques, which now is only used by Google, by Facebook. Yesterday, we had a call with Google, they came to us, now to bring it in to the European companies. And we're doing a lot. It's about ALICE, and ALICE is probably the last chance. Otherwise, we fall behind. We are really, really working hard as academia to bring our techniques into European companies. And what initiative we now started is, there's Facebook, Google, they are good in this IT. But where we are strong in Europe is a production system in engineering. And now we started a new project to help the companies to bring AI in these production systems, in all engineering things. You saw it from the car industry, self-driving cars, but there's much more. If you sell something, if you sell a fridge, you want to have data back, you want to know what the customer is doing, and you do this with AI. You know exactly what's going on, why some product is failing, why some product is not working, or how it's used, perhaps the different use cases. For the cell phone, the American companies get back the data. What do we in Europe? We sell the product and then lose a user, the customer. That's stupid. Therefore, a new initiative, also within ALICE, we try to really push the industry in Europe, also to bring it into engineering and production systems.
Thank you, Sepp. That was an interesting call for a wake-up call, if I can say. Maybe turning to you, Magda, for the European Tech Alliance and Allegro. Just maybe you wanted to react on what you heard, of course, in the beginning of the conversation, but also do you share Sepp's concerns, and to what extent do you think policymakers, governments, and the Commission have deployed efforts that are really supportive of European and also non-European organizations when it comes to making sure they can develop AI?
Thank you, Ellen. As a representative of European tech scale-ups, so companies which are quite big, are active on the market and have been on the market for quite a while. We have a number of excellent European brands. I would say that we have no doubts that AI plays and will play an essential role in our capacity to be competitive, to offer better and better services to our consumers and our business partners, to improve our efficiency, to simply delegate simple tasks to AI so that talented and savvy people can do something more innovative, to make our companies greener, to detect fraud. It has a huge potential, as our companies are really tech-driven. They're really different. We have retailers, we have e-commerce platform, music industry. We're really companies across sectors, but what we agree to is that AI is essential. I think it's worth stressing, and I think it builds on what Professor has just said, that the uptake of AI, I would say, is relatively low. This is something that companies are developing and expanding. So for that reason, the regulatory framework that you've mentioned and that the European Union is ahead of preparing will play an important role. I would stress that here a positive approach that also Michael mentioned it's really important. We would argue that in general, AI application or machine applications do not pose risk to physical well-being, fundamental rights, health system, etc. So this should be a basic statement. And there, if we want to regulate, let's make sure that this regulation will not sniffle the innovation that we're currently adopting, because this technology is quite new. And I would agree that it would be a missed opportunity to regulate too strictly and too prematurely. Maybe that's it for the start.
No, thank you very much. I think we'll definitely come back to some of the things you've just mentioned. So before we do that, I still wanted to, let's say, make sure the round is complete, the first round is complete. With you, Phil, of Facebook, maybe asking you a similar question as to what you think, where you think the main efforts should lie towards EU and non-EU organizations when they're developing and deploying AI, and how maybe you're reconciling the vision of Facebook as a global organization and the contribution and support to the European leadership in AI. How maybe are you doing that, perhaps by supporting your smaller businesses, and what are the policies that you identify would be likely to help you maintain that support?
Sure. Thanks, Alina. Thanks, everybody. I think even in the first three introductory remarks there, there's some hugely important pieces of the puzzle here for us to look at. And so maybe first some comments on Facebook overall. As you rightly said, Facebook is a global organization, but with a strong history and presence in Europe. We do have a lot of staff based here in Europe as well. A lot of our AI work takes place within Europe as well, for an example. And so it's something that we believe a strong European Union, in terms of its work and its progress in AI, is a value to Facebook as well. We think it's an important thing, and we do support a lot of European efforts around AI and research, and also deployment of AI as well. So for us, we really want to kind of highlight two things initially. I mean, Facebook is a very involved when it looks at European SMEs. European SMEs are companies which use the Facebook platform a lot to reach consumers and to use their services across different parts of their industry. And so, this is something that I think, as Magdalena pointed to as well, we see that AI is, of course, going to play a very important part in their business development going forward. And especially, one of the things we've seen now as a result of the recent COVID-19 crisis is that a lot of those businesses have had to digitalize very quickly. And so the development of the tools and skills to be able to manage in this new environment are hugely important. I think Professor Hochreiter very, very correctly pointed to the fact that the use of AI in European industries is absolutely paramount to competitiveness, and the COVID-19 crisis is just emphasizing that as we go forward. So this is something where I think it's going to push us to be more ambitious, hopefully, in how we view our ambition level on what we want to achieve from AI overall. Just one final point, I think, for the opening piece here as well, I wanted to point to is that, of course, AI and data are symbiotic in terms of the relationship between how they interact. We need to get our understanding of the global data economy correct. We've recently seen the issue on cross-border data flows now up for debate and discussion. There needs to be a resolution here in terms of how we manage global data and data flows to enable also that the AI ecosystem becomes a flourishing one in Europe as well as other parts of the world. And then one more final point maybe is, there does need to be a view here, or at least an understanding on how we look at global standards and global kind of norms here for the broader ecosystem. Nick Clegg, our Vice President of Corporate Affairs, published an op-ed in the Washington Post this week where we made that point very clearly that there is a need for different parts of the globe I think Michael early on pointed to the fact that potentially there is different value sets around the world when we look at AI, but also the broader digital ecosystem. And those who have like-minded values and like-minded approaches to some of these questions would benefit from coming together and trying to understand and create a global understanding of some of these issues and challenges. So I'll just leave it there for the opening discussion.
Thank you so much. It's actually making my job easy, because I would really like to ask Michel this question that more or less ties into your last point. So Michel, this, companies and governments presented for months and maybe years now abstract high-level principles for AI. But there are some, different approaches and models for AI governance that could really ensure their implementation, which is the hard part. I was wondering whether you have a take on which ones could work well for, EU's common approach, federating all member states and beyond. As Phil recalled, data is some sort of a global resource to tap into, and perhaps a more global governance approach with global standards and norms for the entire ecosystem would be some kind of the way to go. I think you have to unmute to say. Thanks.
Good. It happens once every session. So I think you tipped the right points on what we're looking at, and it's also about doing a lot of things simultaneously. So we have to engage in terms of discussions and standards globally. But at the other end of the spectrum, we also have to make sure that we implement really practically the guidelines we see. I think the last year probably, I think there is sort of a shift in the discussion, because it used to be on the what, it used to be on the why, and that's where all the ethics discussions come from. And I think it's not. I think everyone agrees now that we want to have ethical AI. There's not that discussion is not on the table anymore. Now it's more of a question on how, and that's where the difficulty comes. And I think it has two elements. It has the element of how to interpret an ethical, and I think Phil said that quite eloquently, how to interpret an ethical guideline in a specific culture, and that differs globally, but also differs within Europe. So I think there's work to be done there. We are doing work there on the Council of Europe, obviously, and also in Brussels. And then there's a question on the how. If we have those guidelines, how does that work inside our organizations? What do I put into hands of the developers? Who decides on which AI model currently developing is high risk, and who decides on and to what standards decides the guy or girl if we want to do that kind of AI or not? And looking from, and that's I think from my perspective quite interesting to look at an organization as the Ministry of Security and Justice, as I have a sort of a double role. On the one side, looking at the policy side for the Netherlands and Europe on getting responsible AI going, but also in implementing responsible AI inside my organization and sort of getting the AI development going inside the organization. And well, having a Ministry of Security and Justice with a police force connected to it, with a judicial system connected to it, with all kinds of crime prevention, you also get quite quickly in the realm of high-risk AI. So that's why we're really into the and really supportive of what the European Union is doing, and sort of stepped up the game and said, well, we have to have a discussion on the risks of AI. Because it is obviously dependent on the context in which you put AI, but there is a lot of AI, and I think Magdalena said that quite well. There's a lot of AI that's quite harmless. If a police officer decides has 10,000 hours of video and decides to train an AI model to look at blue vans, and it helps him or her to really get the kind of video footage out fast on that type of images. I don't consider that to be quite harmful. There are obviously some other applications in law enforcement, and already mentioned, I think in the previous speaker, was face recognition, which is also the golden example of high risk AI in some terms, which we have to look quite good at, obviously. So let's wrap up. I think 2 times. Yes, we have to do the global discussion. Yes, we have to do the regional discussion, and yes, we have to do the organizational discussion as well. We have to do that at the same time.
Thank you. And yeah, as you recall, there are many public organizations and companies that already use AI systems for decision making in recruitment, or to enhance public security. Perhaps a quick word from you, and then I'll ask Magda as well, and Phil, how do you believe the Commission's risk-based approach, so in its white paper, how is it supportive of the testing and auditing of an AI system that wouldn't disrupt the use of that system or impose a burden on the development of that system, in order to also make sure we do use the societal benefits these systems represent?
Yes. Well, I think, first of all, I don't believe I haven't met any developer who wants to make bad AI or discriminatory AI. So there is a really good sort of sense of mission there, also in the developer community, to make good design decisions and to do good engineering. But still, if you are going to set up, if you're going to develop an AI application with a team of only white males, ranging in the age category of 25 to 35, you have sort of an inbred risk in your development cycle, which you're maybe not aware of. And I think that's what we're have to sort of get out of the system. That's why diversity is so important. That's why I'm happy that we're not only a middle-aged man in this conversation. Sorry, Seb and Phil, but well, we are. So looking at those things, I think, are not at the forefront of, I think, small and medium enterprises, and looking at the labor market. Even if you want to hire women in an engineering capacity, or you want to hire minorities, maybe it's just not there in the labor in the labor population at this point in time. So we have to work on policies that enhance that and help that. And will that be a burden? Yeah, my hope as a policymaker always is that we sort of stimulate and give a positive incentive to the development teams that are doing good, and help the development teams that are doing not so good along. But obviously, I think policies will have a burden. I think that can't be sort of figured out, but we have to strike a balance there. And that's why we in the Netherlands try to do that in a multi-stakeholder format, and we try to really engage with the people doing it, and not sort of inventing it behind our desk here in our attics.
Thank you very much, Michel, for this insightful response. And now maybe Magda, you'd like to react to the issue as we framed it.
Yes, I think I would pick up on the point that Michel made on the risk, because here I think is an essential element and something of key importance when it comes to this regulation. Really defining what's high risk will, on the one side, decide if we do not sniffle innovation, but simply making it too impractical and cumbersome to implement machine learning, algorithmic solutions, and AI. But on the other hand, if we don't make the regulation too broad to effectively address the risk that exist within certain applications of certain AI. So I think that risks need to be properly addressed, and it shouldn't be too broad. If we now define high risk as very broad risk, then we won't make the job well. And I would argue that in terms of the right approach now, we would favor the phased approach. So for the low risk application, I think building on what has been prepared by high level working group and the Commission toolbox, this is something which is very useful for companies in their process of making uptaking AI, but also in their reflection on how to, within our operations, make sure that what we do is indeed based on principle, is human-centric, that we have processes in place that allow to detect bias, to correct it if needed. So I think on this low risk, the self-regulation is an essential element. And I think it's very valuable that this work is being done, that this discussion takes place now. Whereas I think for high-risk applications, here some regulation might be useful. But first, we need to make sure that regulation do not exist for such uses. Let's only remind ourselves about GDPR and some safeguards it offers for automated decision-making, for example, not to mention the entire privacy context. But also the second point on risk, high risk, I did appreciate the point that the, MEP Sharasova made earlier today, that if we want to have innovation, there's a degree of risk that we need to be ready to bear. And of course, let's try to mitigate it to the extent possible. But it would be very unfortunate to simply ban an AI application because there's a risk or even high risk involved.
Thank you, Magda, and I very much agree. I really like the point that MEP Charantsova made. She really framed it very well this morning. Thank you. Maybe Phil, you'd like to contribute on how helpful is the approach of the Commission when it comes to the legal framework in general, but also testing and auditing of AI systems. Maybe you could comment on the lessons learned with previous legal frameworks like the GDPR, and maybe what does that mean human-centric for a company like Facebook, human-centric AI, and how do you view self-regulation, a little bit the way Magda talked about? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, because I think there's obviously a need to ensure that high-risk AI and other things are properly able to be assessed and understood and comprehended by those authorities who are there to do so. At the same time, how do you do that in a way in which you don't create an overarching burden for a broad industrial base across Europe? One thing that we see now very clearly is that we've almost passed the phase where businesses need to digitalize, especially in large industries. Most of them have done that to a greater or lesser extent. A lot of them now are adopting more of a platform-style business model, trying to use AI and data to optimize and offer services. So when we think about these applications of AI, this is going to be a broad industrial base which is utilizing AI. And so what's going to be really important first and foremost is some really clear definitions of what we're talking about as well. When, for example, I'm sure Professor Hochheit has a much better idea than I do on the telecoms networks, for example. But when we look at kind of an advancement into an IoT environment here, which is again based around AI, for example, how do we understand the risk there, and how do we understand the definitions of these types of things going forward? So clarity on the definitions is going to be really important for us going forward. We're used to a self-assessment environment. It's existed in the GDPR, so that's something which is probably something that's common in a lot of businesses, which they're able to move through in hopefully a relatively easy manner. But I think one of the really important points there as well, I was slightly off from the regulation, but the point raised by Michael on biases as well, I think that's a very important one. And I think Michael was referencing maybe some of our teams that tend to be of a certain age bracket and maybe from a certain background, but we do encourage an enormous amount of diversity in how we're trying to develop these products and services. And so we do have something which we call our fairness flow, which allows teams, for example, to run through their algorithms to check for biases before we move to the production stage, before we make these products live. So, we do have a conscious effort now to try and ensure that these biases are hopefully understood and then avoided before we move into a production environment. But I think it's, again, from the regulatory perspective, what's hugely important, clarity and then a procedure which is workable as well at scale. Given the prevalence of AI in society, this is going to be a really important balance to try and strike.
Thank you, Phil. Turning to you, Seb, I have seen some comments from our participants. One of them is thanking you for the enthusiastic presentation and agrees with you that some decisive action is needed in the EU with less bureaucracy and more practical applications. And some agree that the EU is at risk of falling behind and that we should set perhaps our guidelines for application of AI in terms of ethics and human rights, but let us not forget about the importance of entrepreneurial dominance and making sure we take care of that. I wanted to ask you, we talked about how AI systems, there are so many of them. If you come up with rules, it's context dependent. How can we implement this? In research hubs, in different companies, what are the standards that should work? What is feasible? And if I may ask a follow-up question on the white paper, the Commission's white paper refers to this ambition to build a lighthouse center of research, innovation, and expertise to become a reference worldwide excellence in AI and to host the best talents in the field. Do we need some sort of a CERN or a DARPA of AI, maybe as an additional question to you?
Let me first go into the topic of my previous speakers, because there were some misconceptions and something went wrong here. You talked about applications. You have to distinguish between basic research and applications. If there's a face recognition system, the same system can recognize cancer, and healing cancer is good. Perhaps recognizing face not. We have to distinguish between the application thing and the basic research. And the same techniques here, CNNs, are used for both. This should be clearly distinguished. Then there was talk about bias. Bias is on the data side. In AI, we have, and in learning, perhaps I'm one of the pioneers of deep learning. I don't know whether you heard about deep learning. It's one of the techniques now used in machine learning. I founded this. And here we have first an algorithm. Then we have data where we learn from. And the bias is in the data. And there are different bias. There's a whole thing. It could be in the input or in the output. Because perhaps you have a wrong labeling. Perhaps if you give the salary for men and women, perhaps it's not like you want to have it, because an AI system will do the same as the data is telling you. And if the humans is doing wrong and you tell the AI system, do the same as the humans, the AI system cannot correct it because it have to clone the human behavior. And if human do it wrong, then you have the problem. That's on the data side. You can clean up the data. And then the last part is the application. Where to apply which thing. This should be clearly distinguished. I can give you some stories later. The question is, we had a collaboration with Audi. Audi is a German car company. And I also talked to Chang Huang. He's CEO of NVIDIA, and with the self-driving group of his. And we had an idea how to do it, how to use neural networks directly for trajectory planning. But with Audi, because of the regulations, we could not proceed. And 2 months later, NVIDIA has this implemented, has even a video on the internet, has the same idea NVIDIA made, and we could not do the research because EU did not allow us to do the research because of the data regulation. Another example, we want to do research. I cannot do it in Europe because of the data regulations, and therefore Baidu is a company, it's from China, offered me that the whole a part of the city of Beijing I can use for collecting data. But I didn't collaborate with this Baidu guys because they were very greedy. As I said, data should not leave China. Because I also did supervising of the Chinese government concerning AI, but they don't care about regulation. But the danger here in Europe is over-regulation. Please find a sweet spot. If I cannot do my basic research, like you said, is 2 + 2 = 4, is it ethical or not? And I have discussed all the time, I don't know whether 2 + 2 is ethical or not. It's a complicated question, but that's what we're doing in Europe, only talking about regulations, but not thinking about how can we foster the technology. If we don't understand the technology, how can we regulate the technology we don't understand? And also I vote for let's also doing research in this technique and not kill all research in Europe concerning AI. I don't think it's a good idea. If we are some masters of regulations, we also should a little bit understand it. And as I said, we are leading in some branches in AI and Google and also Facebook. Facebook also used my technique. There was also some guy from Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, he visited our conferences and he's a smart guy and implemented many of our algorithms which were developed in Europe. That was, but you had a different question, sorry, because I have to clarify this.
Oh, yeah, I was also asking whether you think having a DARPA of AI or CERN of AI could be a...
I remember, thank you. That's absolute nonsense. AI does not work like this. We are working, you have CERN, you have something like this. There you need the device centrally, but AI is, research in machine learning is working completely different. You need data storages, but we had some projects with pharma companies like this, and I do it in Iceland. You have also data in Iceland because it's cheaper to do compute and also compute in Iceland, which would be provided by NVIDIA, but it have not be locally there because you can go remote. We learned this from the COVID crisis. You can do a lot of stuff remote, and machine learning AI is digital techniques. You can do it remote. To make a data center or to make a center, a physical center, is absolute nonsense.
Thank you very much for your candid response.
Perhaps to clarify,
oh, sure.
But it makes sense to make, as we did in Alice, we did small centers where the expertise is going to the companies to have to build a local ecosystem and build a network. That makes absolute sense. But to make a big center, that's stupid. That's just stupid.
Thanks. I'm sure a lot of our participants definitely copied what you said. Thank you so much. And I just have a little follow-up question, because you've mentioned that regulations sometimes can be a bottleneck. You've given a couple of examples, to develop technology. To what extent, and this was also a question from our participants earlier in the chat, which I picked up on from Stefano, to what extent are scientists taken into consideration in all these regulatory discussions? Do you feel they're taken into account sufficiently?
It's a question to me. I'm suffering very hard from it because most of my researchers are going to Google, also to Facebook in Paris. I have a very nice site. Facebook is really cool, by the way, also for researchers. But they're leaving, academia is leaving Europe because of this regulations. That's a thing which, let's say, I don't like. Also, with data, we need regulation, but regulation in such a sense that research is still possible.
Thank you once again for your response. Now, I wanted to get back to a little bit more the the proposal of the Commission itself and what the plans are. There's a call from a number of MEPs to create a unified EU-wide body to oversee policy coordination for AI across member states, so a European AI agency. And maybe I wanted to, so let's maybe over to you, Michelle, and then maybe Magda. How do you view this? Should there be a structure like this? And if there should be, what kind of role should we give it? What would be the pros and cons? Would it help align and coordinate all member states' activities, maybe the resources and the funding, or should it rather be a mix of institutionalized, some sort of coordination with a decentralized model?
Yeah, I think I think we already have such an agency, which is called the European Commission. So I'm sort of grasping with the idea on how much coordination do you actually want. I think it could be in good hands of the Commission just to bring together the member states and getting together and implementing and doing it side by side. I'm not really. We don't have an official position on that yet, so it's still also a bit of a personal view. But I'm not really sort of envisioning what such an European agency could bring to the table extra. I think there is. We need, obviously, as I said, a lot of work being done in implementing. We also have to have sort of an agile system of policy making into place. That means that we don't sort of try to make one big regulation. That'll take us 5 years and organize everything we know. I think what we have to take a sort of a stepping stone approach and taking the things we know and then putting them through the policy making process and setting up a sort of a system in which we can elaborate and advance quickly. Let's, for instance, think about high risk. We believe, and I think Magda said that very well. We don't believe that high risk is a broad category. It's not like, well, everything law enforcement does is high risk application. I think we have to really look at it, and I believe Seb said that well as well. We don't have to regulate the technology. We have to regulate sort of a specific application in a context, and then view it as high risk. So not looking at regulating face recognition, but looking at maybe what types of face recognition in what specific context do we find undesirable. And then saying, well, we can decide with a number of in the policy community, with the Parliament, with the European Commission, we can decide, well, this specific application we define as high risk, and we have a number of criteria, and then the list of what is specifically high risk can be growing. Sort of an agile way of looking at that policy and then moving along. So not really institutionalizing it in a big agency, but doing it in a more, like you said, I think in a more decentralized way.
Thank you very much. Magda, did you want to comment on this part of the conversation and, back to also the governance aspects within AI agency?
So it's also, I think, more my personal view than UTA or Allegro, but I would agree with what Michelle and Seb previously said, that this is more a decentralized approach, and let's say more bottom-up than top-down at this stage especially. So I would be quite careful with setting up such an agency. One point which I think is linked to this idea, as I think very often when we talk about having authority for platforms, for AI, for data, for different types of for different issues, is that we have to bear in mind that AI, as much as any other area, is to a large extent already regulated, and regulators also exist. And let's just mention privacy, GDPR, and national regulators. Let's mention labor law, right? Which also, when it comes to AI in, for example, recruitment process, right, or employees assessment, there are also national regulations, but sometimes also structures in place to enforce these regulations. So for me, this comes back to the point about consistency of this regulation. If we decide to regulate, be it risk or high risk, which I think is the better approach, we need to make sure that this risk is not yet sufficiently addressed by something we have in place. Because if we have several layers of using AI, then I think it will really be cumbersome for companies to implement, especially those smaller ones, right? Which may start with a great idea, but eventually stumble, like Seb was saying, when they realize that they have a great idea, great product, but eventually it's illegal, although it's not causing any harm, but could do really big good for the society. I think that would be really a loss.
Yeah, and it's often the use of a system that can present risks rather than the technology itself. I don't want to ambush anyone, but there's this interesting question from a participant, and maybe one of you can react as a follow-up to our discussion on the governance of AI. Jean-Pascal Peltier is asking, do you think we will come to a point where tech companies will have to hire a chief compliance officer to ensure AI regulation implementation, as we have seen in the past 30 years in the bank and finance sphere? Is there anyone who would like to react to Jean-Pascal's question?
I can have an experience. What's missing for the regulation? Not everything is known in the companies. They don't know how to handle it. We have now, I think, about 15 companies asking us, is this allowed? How can we handle this? Yes, you need a chief compliance officer, but also you need a chief data officer, and you need many new jobs. You should fill them within your company. A guy who knows what is conform with regulations, a guy who knows what can be done, what is the systems, what's possible, a guy who knows about how to address the data stuff. Yes, it's necessary, and the companies are asking for this.
Yeah, and actually it's a good transition to another small part of the discussion I wanted to have with you, which is about trying to find that talent, those guys, as you mentioned, that can really help with AI. So maybe I can turn to Michel for this on this talent issue, and then Phil, as an organization, how is it easy to find that talent? Because I've read more than half of European companies find it hard to hire IT specialists, and there's a concentration of AI skills that's very common. You have a lot of AI talent in Western Europe, in urban areas, and it is, again, back to the spreading the benefits of AI. It is the retention of AI workers and the attraction training is a new differentiator between EU member states. So those that have less AI skilled workers are likely to face competitiveness and innovation challenges, and that could widen the gap between different parts of the bloc. So how can we, address this? How can member states act more efficiently? Because, to address this talent and skills challenge, given it's a member state competence education, what are the solutions you think, Michel, could work to overcome this?
Yeah, well, if I had all the solutions, I think the problem would be solved. But I think it will take us some years to really get that going. I really like what Seb is saying, is that it's not only about technical talent, but I think it's about getting the technical knowledge to a certain extent also to all kinds of other disciplines. So I think there will be a massive market for lawyers who know what LTSM is, for instance, and who can sort of grasp the basic idea of what that means for lawmaking and for all kinds of judicial activities. And what I feel is that we sort of have been lagging behind in, I don't know how it is in other countries, but let's say in the Netherlands, I know it, is that we've been lagging behind in sort of digitalizing our entire workforce. Every month I stumble upon a specialist in the field of lawmaking or maybe some other expert field, and I'm talking about this sort of transition we are making in digitizing our society and AI, which is coming in their applications, and they all sort of say, well, that's something for the techies. And I think the biggest challenge we face as a European society is that we have to sort of switch the attitude. We sort of have to switch on the attitude and make everyone sort of a tech believer. And I think there are some good examples in that. I feel, and it's commonly mentioned, but I think in this specific sphere, I think Estonia is an interesting example. There are lots of people who I've been speaking to in Estonia who all actually sort of have a sort of positive attitude and a sort of a warming and inviting attitude towards technology and digitalization. I don't see that in our society in that broadness. So one of the things in terms of solutions which we also decided to implement is a good idea from Finland, which has a national AI course for all people. And they decided to say, well, we want to have an online course which is free for all, and every citizen in society should do that. And we aim at, I think, 1% of the population. And I think in 2 years' time, they had that 1%. We did that. We copied that idea. We have a national AI course in the Netherlands as well. And inside my organization, I sort of promote that to every worker and we have 120,000 people working in the domain of security and justice. And everywhere I come, I say, well, if you do the national AI course, it will take you 4 to 6 hours looking at videos and clicking some questions. But I give you a chocolate bar if you send me the diploma. And unfortunately, I didn't reach out. I didn't have to send thousands and thousands of those chocolate bars. It's only one a week actually. What is currently the pace that it's going. But it's incentivizing people. Even my children, it's quite difficult to get them. There's also a junior course on that. It's quite difficult to incentivize them to get into and to get a basic grasp of what this technology is going to do. I think to lay that foundation in society is one of the things we're working on in the Netherlands with these types of instruments.
Thank you. Phil, did you want to react on this issue of, trying to find the right talent and what Michel also explained?
Yeah, Michel kind of mentioned all the things I was going to mention. I mean, I've and it seems everyone gets a reward for AI. Seth got some mojitos, Michel's giving out chocolate bars. So one of the things, I've worked in, I would argue, a more traditional industry, and now, working at Facebook. One of the things I see is the overarching difference is just culture in the organization. Culture. A data-driven culture that allows a company to not, in some of the previous work I've done, I'd say a lot of companies view AI as a little bit like fairy dust. You just sprinkle a little bit of AI over whatever problem you've got, and voila, you'll make life better. It doesn't work that way, by and large. It's something you have to have ingrained in your organizational structure to be able to continue to evolve and optimize your organization, and to be part of the broader AI ecosystem. That's hugely important. So I think there is a hugely important role for governments to modernize education systems, to build the talent required and the pipeline of people to move into different industries to be able to be that AI talent and knowledge, but it's not. I view it a little bit like the discussion we had for about 15 years in Europe around innovation, when people started talking about the need for a chief innovation officer and an innovation department and these kinds of things. I think we're in the same area now, an era with AI and data. This is a cross-cutting technological advance for nearly every industry that requires an organization to fully optimize its entire processes to be optimized for the utilization of AI and data in every single way. So I think, excellence centers are great. They drive thinking. Probably some of the most important roles are played by Professor Hochreiter and his colleagues in terms of pushing the boundaries of understanding. But then there is this big piece of work for European industries to do to ingrain it in the culture of the organizations to really work in a way in which, a lot of companies, platform companies like ourselves, I mean, Facebook couldn't survive without AI. It is the company. It drives the majority of the things we do. And so I think that's probably one of the most important things, especially for traditional industries that maybe are slightly slower to adapt to some of the technological advances. And I think what we see here is some smaller organizations have an advantage to leapfrog as well. If you can very early on in your process, whatever company or industry you're in, become a data-driven and an AI-centric company and organization, that can give you a strong competitive advantage versus other people. So just some view there from my experience, what the difference generally is, and those companies who are making really good progress in this area.
May I comment on this, Phil? There's Facebook, of course, but I was invited to other companies. It's Samsung in South Korea, in Naver. And they also, they're not only internet technology companies, and they do a good job. They do better than we do in Europe to transfer their internal stuff. And also everybody's motivated to implement, to take up the new technologies within weeks, within months. And if I then go to the European companies, the culture, the kind of thinking is different.
Magda, yes?
Yes, if I may add, because I think we touched a very important point, and I wrote down how Sepp put it. It's not about really employing a chief AI compliance officer. It's really about employing someone who knows about AI, right? If we cannot employ someone who's savvy in AI, then we won't have AI. And just to give you an example of a company that I represent, which is Allegro, a Polish online marketplace, when it started, AI and the uptake of AI started by simply having a first smaller team of people that would reflect how AI could be used within the organization, growing this team, and then having a reflection, employing chief data officer, and having a reflection of how this AI can be used for the benefit of our consumers, to improve our service, to improve everything that we normally do for our clients and for our business with the use of AI. And then as we grow internally on that matter, we're thinking how to make sure that what we do is ethical, that we have processes in place, and that we build on high-level expert group recommendations. We're really learning. There was also, I think Michelle was also stressing this learning attitude. So this is how it's done. And if we really don't have people to employ from Europe, then simply AI won't be done in Europe. And I think this is the part about which I think somehow it's a bit overlooked, but also it remains largely within the competences of the member states. Is education, working conditions, taxation, everything that is really defining how we as European companies, how competitive we are in employing talents, right? To make sure that they stay, that they have room to innovate, right, etc. So I really would stress that if we want to have AI made in Europe, we need to have talents. And of course, there's also another approach where SMEs will benefit from services offered by others, right? And this is how it's often done, and this is also to their benefit. But I understand we also have, we want to have human-centric AI developed in Europe, and I think we really reached a crucial point in this discussion. Where should focus really be?
Thanks, Magda. I actually have just one comment from a participant, and thank you all for the great interaction in the chat, by the way. So there's one that really agrees with what was said about new ideas and innovations that really do come from business, even though some basic safeguards against misuse are important, and that regulation should always only be a response to a stage of development that the humankind reaches, and that you cannot just innovate top down from an administrative center. And I wanted to bring us back to the point that was made by Michelle and Phil regarding the data culture and the importance to champion tech. Magda, I'd like to have a couple of thoughts on this from you before we switch to questions from our participants. So I think, popular opinion and the perception of AI is really going to shape the development of policy and governance and the use of technology. And there's this Oxford University report that's pretty recent that showed that worries about AI are quite high in Europe. You have 43% that find it mostly harmful, and 38% find AI helpful. And in China, those figures are 59% find it helpful and 9% find it harmful. That echoes what Michelle mentioned about some member states are more tech enthusiastic than others. And some have raised concerns that, the discourse we have in EU towards innovation and AI is maybe not sufficiently opportunity driven. We focus on the risks, the precautionary principle is very much marking our approaches. How can this affect the readiness of our, population and the workforce to embrace AI, try to learn more about it, go to take that course, elements of AI, rather than fearing the technology? What's your take on that?
So I think it's a broad question, and it's often in the regulation when we want to regulate risks, and then we need to balance of what actually regulates. I think this is a question that is relevant in AI, but also in other areas. What we did as the European Tech Alliance in the position paper that we launched earlier. It was already last year because it wasn't online. So yeah, November last year. We were trying in our position paper to simply present a number of practical examples of how our companies use AI. So just to give you a few, for example, Spotify can deliver personalized music recommendations based on user preferences and listening habit. Zalando can offer a great dresses or clothes based on what you previously bought, on the colors you previously preferred. Some companies like Booking can ensure that the reviews are not fakes, and that the property someone wants to land is actually exist and is there. Not to mention, for example, improving logistics to make sure that parcels are rightly delivered in a manner that allow to reduce carbon footprint, because they can be put together and delivered to one place within the same car. So if we talk more about these uses of AI, and I think it's quite straightforward that they're not risky. They're simply making our lives easier in providing our services, but also our customers safer and hopefully happier. I think that we can maybe turn this negative perception to a more comprehensive and simply broad understanding of AI. But I think also panels like this, when we exchange and learn from one another, plays an important role.
Thank you, Magda. Now we have something like 20 minutes to get into a conversation a little bit more with our participants. I've been just checking some of the polls, and just for your reference, maybe I'll to see maybe you also have some reactions to those results. So there was a question asked to our participants: agree or disagree? Europe is winning the global AI race, and we have 6% of our participants that agree, 94% disagree. And another question: agree or disagree? AI can be used to reduce human biases. 66% agree and 34% disagree. So there's lots of nice questions and things to pick up from there. But perhaps one of you would like to react to one of these two results.
Yeah, I think when looking at it as a race, we're dead in the water, but not from all of it. I think Professor Hochreiter said it in the beginning. I think the European has quite a good position if we're looking at industrial AI. So it's not one market. That's not the market of we all think of consumer products and stuff like that. But if you look at industrial, maybe we have a shot there. So that's one. The other one is, I think, if you look at it as a race, things are not going that well. So why is it a race? Why do we view it as a race? Why do we have to have this this sort of a cutthroat pace in innovation? You know, it's who is setting that pace, and can we discuss also on the pace, maybe globally? Is this the way we want this thing to sort of fold out through our societies? Maybe it is better to sort of not saying that it's a race, but getting the sort of the heat out of the game a bit. So that's, I think, my take on discussions about race.
Perhaps some comments to this. I completely agree. We don't have to look only at these internet technologies. Let's look at other fields where we are leading in Europe, still leading from car companies, production systems and stuff like this. But also there will AI come in. And there we are leading on the market, and we are leading in developing new technologies that we are doing here in Europe. And even if we don't build a better search engine, but we can build better production system in the companies, more efficient logistics centers. And this we are doing right now in a lot of collaborations with companies. And here we are leading. And we are the first ones apply AI. And with applying AI, our collaboration partners increase their market presence. And here we are leading. Now we are not behind, we are in front in this areas.
Actually, that ties well into. Oh, sorry, Phil. Go on.
Yeah, no, just a quick comment, because I sometimes think the race analogy is a little unhelpful in what we're talking about here. You know, this is not really a race, i.e. there's one starting point and one finishing point. You know, it's more like a sort of giant Olympic Games with thousands of different events in which Europe does hold a very strong position in a number of areas. And Professor Hochreiter has rightly pointed to where Europe historically has its industrial strength. And so therefore there is a certain balancing there of different fields of AI, our AI application, where Europe, you know, does and can have a leadership position. I think if we, especially from a policy position, look at this as a, you know, a singular race from point A to point B, then we miss some of the nuance that's required to potentially focus on specific areas and specific challenges that can really maximize the value of what Europe has at its disposal when it comes to its assets.
Yeah, and I really like the way you focus on the fact that the EU should invest in its own strength, and I think this is a point that was made many times before in the discussion. Also, when it comes to the data strategy, you know, investing in industrial data. But tying into that, I have a question from a participant to Sepp, because you're saying we should champion other, areas and maybe not build the next search engine. So should we focus more on developing specialized chip technologies as an alternative to NVIDIA? Someone's asking this question to you.
we are working on this. Also within Alice, we are working with Qualcomm. There's another company in Finland. These are two companies. And here we're building AI on the edge. And this is a thing my friend from NVIDIA does not like it. But we want to build analog systems at the sensors. Don't transfer so much data across thing, but already do this AI techniques, these filters, these neural networks on the sensor. And here in Finland and Qualcomm companies located in Europe are leading, are developing right now. But I also was approached by a company, it's called Huawei. It's somewhere in China. And another company from Shanghai, they're also working on this. And also, yes, Samsung also came. Samsung also is working on this stuff. There's also a race, but here Europe is not behind, but I don't know who is making it. It's about on the edge, at the sensors, low energy, and filtering out the data before it's transmitted across the computers. That's technology we also use for self-driving cars, for Alexa, for all these kind of things. You need this technique. Yes, we should look into it. Who will lead? Don't know.
Thank you so much. I have other questions naturally from our participants. Just quickly back to the polls, I'm seeing that according to 52% of our participants, the EU should partner more with Chinese companies and universities on AI research, and 83% agree that the EU should partner more with US companies and universities on AI research. So this is interesting. I mean, we didn't necessarily elaborate on, how the European framework can be supportive of higher and lower income countries, take into account the diversity within the EU, but also beyond, which countries should we collaborate more with? But if that's all right, I would like to direct the question to any of you who'd like to react to this.
Perhaps I have to comment on this China collaborations, because first of all, I was advisor for the Chinese government concerning AI, and I was approached by a couple of Chinese companies, and it's difficult. For Huawei, we not went over the NDA because the European thinking is different, the regulations are different, and it's really hard to make collaboration with them because there's a different thinking. So I want to say, hey, everything stays in China, you can come to us. With American companies, it's completely different. Perhaps do you know that we are leading here in the field of AI for climate change? Probably you heard about climate change. And we have the best models, and therefore Google asked us whether they can give us some money as a present to finance this research topic, because the PR of AI is not good. And we have the best hydrology models worldwide here in Linz. And Google is financing us and asking us whether they can give us money. We are leading, perhaps AI for climate change. We are leading here. And Google is building up. There are other companies coming up. And yes, we can collaborate better with American companies. And for me, it was really hard to do it with Chinese companies. That was my...
That's interesting. Would anyone follow up on that useful comment from Seb? No? Well, it's okay, because I have many other questions, of course, from participants. So one of them, Mark, is asking, again, if any of you would like to take this question, is asking you whether you could, as a group of panelists, tell us more about the role of standards to support trustworthy AI. I know, Phil, you mentioned that earlier, the level of readiness in that space, and whether standards can be useful. How can standardization process work in a broad area where technology and innovation move so fast? And I think he means new solutions might fix the issue as that a standard might try to tackle. Would anyone like to respond to Mark?
I would have, again, sorry if I think, we have some collaborations with TÜV Germany and TÜV Austria. where we try to build up certificates for AI systems. It's hard to build standards. Standards is difficult, but certificates in a sense of you did the right kind of evaluation, state of the art, what's from the research is the best, and you use the right data to the best of your knowledge. You check for biases, stuff like this. We're working on with some government agencies on certifications. Also within Alice, we are trying to go in this direction. Standardization is a little bit more difficult.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to react?
Yeah, to follow up on that, I think one of the big questions we're facing with actually is how to measure the effectiveness and of an AI model in terms of values. So what kind of threshold, what kind of benchmark I would find appropriate in terms of discrimination? Is that 80%? Is that 90% non-discrimination? Is it 95%? Knowing that AI models aren't perfect. There will always be some sort of bias, as we humans have as well. So what Professor Hochreiter sort of said, and I think it's quite interesting. I would really look into that further, because how can we get a sort of agreed measuring methodology on the scoring of what we think is okay AI in a certain application area, so that we can move past the discussion about, well, it's bad or it's good. It will be sort of levels of gray. That's what I learned about this technology, is that it's not like old-fashioned computing, that it's always getting the same results. No, it's always getting sort of a combination of statistical possibilities, and then it is better than a human, but it's still fallible. And how can we measure? Can we get a sort of a measuring methodology of that fallibility in terms of privacy, in terms of inclusion, in terms of gender equality, in terms of discrimination, in terms of all these values we find important? And then if we can get a measuring methodology which is agreed upon, we can start a debate, also a political debate, on what kind of quality we actually like in our AI applications in a certain specific area. And obviously, when you're talking about an autopilot in a plane, that will be a bit higher than when it's about an application which I use on my bike.
Thank you, Michel. Sorry, Seb, I just wanted to bring in Phil and Magda back into the conversation. Perhaps, Phil, you wanted to comment on what you heard. I don't want to add an additional question, but I have a lot.
Yeah, I just concur, right? I think standards are hard in the sense that I don't think AI particularly fits into one neat box that you can define as a sort of standard model. I think Professor Hochreiter has a very good point there, which is about how do you potentially look at validating processes as opposed to regulating outcomes. And potentially there's something we can learn there from that. Just as an example, we're working actually in the Netherlands, which is we now have a AI policy prototyping program underway, in which we're working with a number of companies based across the EU, so over a 6-week period, to run some models of the application of certain regulatory principles, to understand how does that affect the way in which they work, how does that affect the outcomes that are there. So what we're trying to do is kind of build a sort of small sandbox here to try and understand how some of these processes are going to be implemented and what the impact's going to be on businesses and users overall. So I think that's a really important thing to look at. I think standards work in a standard industry, and I think AI in itself is a very varied piece of technology that will exist across many varied industries. So standards are tricky in that sense.
Thank you, Phil. Magda?
Yeah, I think I would argue with everything that has been said, and some really interesting point. If you want to set up standards, how do we measure them? How do we enforce them? I think that's also a valid question in the global economy. maybe adding to one point, standards, if they're formalistic, probably are not a good idea. But I would stress the point about predictability. If companies are to invest in AI technologies, in building their capacities on data and on AI, then having let's say some sort of standards that will apply within a given period of time is very important. So here I would come back to the value of the guidelines. If we build on them, we should be sure that these guidelines or these rules won't change during the game. Of course, they will need to be interpreted, they will be developed, but I would only stress this point about predictability for companies when it comes to rules.
I have one final question. We have only a bit less than 3 minutes left. Perhaps if each of you could in 30 seconds tell me what's the most important piece of feedback that you hope the Commission will take on its AI white paper before releasing its regulation. There was maybe one thing you would change about the strategy. What would it be? Starting with you, Magda, again.
There's 30 seconds after such an interesting discussion is always very tricky. I think I would really insist on risk, on choosing what we want to regulate, not to over-regulate, not to sniffle the innovation, and having this approach in mind that there's a risk that is worth taking, and that we're not to some extent reinventing the wheel. There are applications. There is a comprehensive framework for privacy and values, non-discrimination in the European Union. So it really should be a phasal and targeted approach if we want to regulate AI.
Bill?
Yeah, agree with everything Magda said. I think flexibility for innovation is paramount to what the Commission's going to come with. So I'd really encourage that to be the mindset in the way in which rules are developed. So I think less than in terms of what is in the white paper, which I think is a very solid white paper. It's about how do we develop the scope and the lens through which we interpret these different either societal or industrial questions. And I think that's hugely important to get right in the legislation.
Thank you, Phil. Michel?
Yeah, I would like to say that I think it's of paramount importance that the European Commission looks at the existing frameworks and really sort of interprets them in terms of AI instead of setting sort of a new rule-making framework beside that. Because actually, if you look at it from a bit of a distance, AI is not sort of doing really new things. It's only doing what we do as humans better, maybe faster, and maybe more autonomous. And that obviously will have some questions, but it's not like we're sort of inventing new things that we didn't regulate already. It's actually sort of enhancing humans in doing things that have been regulated already.
Thank you, Michel. And last but not least, Seth, in just a few seconds, what's your recommendation?
I would hope for the EU helping us to build up an ecosystem for AI, going from school to companies, higher education. Not the regulation is the problem, the thinking of the people locally to adapt to AI and to apply AI. Please help us to build up a good ecosystem to use this technique.
Thank you very much. I know that we won't have time to address questions like the one from Punit Bhatia about leveraging existing laws, regulations, because GDPR can already offer principles to use AI responsibly. We have Katarina Jordanova who asked about regulatory sandboxes that could be helpful for research and trying to, having those testing spaces to overcome the challenge of some restrictions at EU level. But thank you all very much. Unfortunately, time flies. We had a very fun panel. We talked about chocolate bars and mojitos, but not only. Thank you very much to you all for your time and for taking part in this panel. And thank you to all our attendees who followed us during the first panel and for the really great and dynamic conversation that's happening in the chat. During the next 15 minutes, you can either a break or join our sponsor, Fiscal Note, and their experts for a Q&A session about how to use policy monitoring and anticipate regulatory risk. It's hosted by Arnaud Senet, who's the Managing Director for Europe of Fiscal Note, and you'll have Cornelia, who's Senior Director at Microsoft there as well. At 11:30, we'll be back to propose 3 breakout sessions in good company to explore how Europe can unleash leadership in AI in the financial sector, the healthcare sector, and in mobility. Continue to engage on Twitter by using our handle and hashtag Data Innovation. Thank you all so very much, and thank you to our colorful panelists for joining us today, and thanks for the invigorating discussion. I will see you all later. We hope you enjoy the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene.
Thank you.